the Ascends at Boston Avenue podcast. My name is Philip Boone, and my co-host is Caitlin Drake. Before we begin, I'd like to state that the views represented in this podcast are those of the individuals in this conversation and not the official position of Boston Avenue United Methodist Church.
Today our guest is Boston Avenue Senior Pastor, Reverend David Wiggs. This past Sunday, you gave your State of the Church address. So we wanted to talk a little bit about that presentation and the conversations that we're hoping to build from that. So just a little bit of background. When did Boston Avenue start doing a State of the Church?
We actually did the first one in September of 2018, but the fall is such a busy time here at Boston Avenue with school starting. A number of our programs begin. We have a number of campaigns going on in September and October, recognition of teachers, stewardship, all those kinds of things. So I thought perhaps it would be better to move it to January, close to the time that there is the State of the Union address, and that maybe that would be a little less busy and actually make more sense to our congregation, that at the beginning of a calendar year we were looking forward to what we were doing and in some ways looking back to where we have been and how that moves us forward. So this was actually the second State of the Church address. I'm anticipating it will be an annual presentation. People have responded in a very positive way to it. So anyway, so this is number 2.
Why do the State of the Church? Is it because you're trying to be transparent? You're just explaining what's going on? But what's the reasoning behind it?
Yes to both of those. It really grew out of a strategic process review that we did in 2018 in the early part of the year before the September address. And one of the things we found after surveying the congregation and the staff were people that either had non-factual information that they thought was factual, or they expressed that they had a lack of information about either our local church or what the staff people were working on, or they didn't understand what was going on with the denomination and how that impacted us. And so out of the discernment process, after we looked at the results of those surveys and interviews, we decided maybe it would be a helpful process for me to take, an hour a year to make a presentation and invite everybody in the congregation that was interested to come hear that.
So would you recommend then something like a State of the Church as a model for other churches?
I think that might be very effective. We're living in a time of what I would call turbulence, unprecedented change in our denomination as well as in our culture. And because of all that, what I'm noticing is heightened anxiety and uncertainty, and that can give rise to rumors and gossip, and inaccurate information can spread quickly. And so having some kind of vehicle, whether it's the State of the Church address or some kind of annual report or something for a congregation, particularly a larger congregation, I think is really helpful. If you think about it, we meet in small groups in a lot of different settings, whether it's Sunday school or a Bible study, or we're in a different worship experience. So we don't always all hear the same information. Also, generationally, we know that people access information through different channels, so they don't always get the same information, or they get incomplete information. So I think it is an effective tool, particularly in times of high anxiety, which I believe we are living in now, to make sure that at least at some, I don't know, we do it annually, but at some periodic time, the leadership of the church makes some very clear statements about who we are and what we're trying to do and how that's going and where we're going, all those kind of things, just as a way to get all the people in the same room to hear the same presentation at once. So, I think it's a model or something like it that others could use to good effect.
And I think it was valuable to have something like this divorced from the worship experience, to really have it be an information generating and giving opportunity, so that folks aren't coming to hear a sermon and, accidentally getting a little bit of information. Or, I think having it
Right.
separate from the sermon is a helpful opportunity for us.
Yes, I thought that was really important. Before we did the first one, we thought about doing it during worship or doing it in the sanctuary. I think we all agreed after discussing it that this was had a little different kind of nature in terms of information and content. It's a good deal longer. We go for 45 minutes. If you do that in a worship setting and you're used to worshiping for only 60 minutes, that really decimates the whole hour and keeps it from our ability to do anything else. So having it in a different setting at a different time, different length of time, and for us, having the availability of different kinds of technology in other spaces compared to our sanctuary is also a key.
Another reason is if you have guests, when they come to the service, they're not expecting to come to the service and hear a 45-minute state of the church.
Right. It really is kind of an insider talk, not that people are excluded or a guest couldn't visit, but it really is, the way I write it, I'm really gearing it toward people who have already made a commitment here, who are already participating and want to know more about the internal workings of the church. So, Philip, you're exactly right. Doing that in a worship setting where we're expecting guests, we've invited guests, we know we have guests every Sunday, it doesn't seem as appropriate to do it in that setting for so many reasons compared to how we've pulled it out and do it at a different time.
What were your main points in the state of the church?
So I tried to think about what I hear from people in terms of the questions they have, the questions I hear the most, and also the ones that generate the most anxiety, and tried to address those. I think it also ties to our goals as well in terms of what we're working on, in terms of our paid staff people, kind of the areas that we're focused on within our work during the week. So anyway, I looked at the finances and where we are, again, in a time of high anxiety. People worry about money. We know, those of us who are reading up on the research and paying attention to what's happening in Christianity in general in the United States, but specifically to the United Methodist Church, we know that worship attendance is down, the number of people joining is decreasing, therefore giving in many sectors is decreasing. We've experienced some of that in the last few years here as well. And so it's important to address that so people have accurate information about that. So I talked about the financial situation and the fact that ours is really strengthening and we're growing again in that arena. We also talked about inclusion, particularly in regard to our LGBTQ friends and family, since that's a major discussion point within the denomination now, and therefore it's been a discussion point here. And again, it's an arena that for some people creates high anxiety. I wanted to talk about how we are addressing that and sort of the theological grounding for that and the biblical reasons that I thought that was important that we move toward full inclusion. Then I also wanted to talk about our move toward a greater presence through things like this podcast, but other digital means of disseminating the gospel, of reaching people, of putting the good news out there. That's a whole new arena. Most of our people don't really think about how their lives have changed in terms of use of their, either whether it's their cell phone or their computer or how they access information or how they do their shopping. We have seen the rise of the use of that technology in a lot of other arenas. I think for the most part, mainline churches or traditional churches like our own have been behind the curve in terms of utilizing new technology. So I addressed the whole idea of what it would mean for us to move toward becoming the number one digital influencer. I just chose the Tulsa metro area because that's sort of where we operate mostly. But in fact, really, when you go digital, you become, you have influence globally because people can access that so much easier than a local newspaper that's printed and dropped off at your house. Or the yellow pages used to be the way that most people, when they came to a new community, first found a church if they were unaware of what the territory looked like. Obviously, the yellow pages is not the way people do that anymore. So to understand that digital platforms are really the way people navigate their lives, and to talk about how we can utilize that for the gospel I thought was important. So those were kind of the three main areas. Then I also spent a little bit of time reminding our people that we're in this ministry together. We're focused outwardly as the gospel is. There's that inherent sense of God's trying to reach people who are not already feeling loved by God or connected to God through a community of faith. But it takes people here who have already made that commitment, have already responded to God's love to do that kind of work. So I talked a little bit about our leadership and the importance of all of us being in ministry together. So those were the keys, I thought. So that's what I focused on.
So digging into each of those points a little more deeply, in terms of the financial situation for the church, what are we looking at for 2020 at Boston Avenue?
Well, we're looking pretty good, I think, for 2020 at Boston Avenue. As I said, we have seen a decline in worship attendance over the last at least 10, maybe 15 or even 20 years. Our giving in some ways has reflected that, although it's been fairly remarkable that even though we've had fewer giving units, so people or families that are making a pledge, in some years our giving and our pledging, those people who make a commitment ahead of time about how many dollars they're estimating they'll give to the church, that's actually gone up in some years, even though our worship attendance or number of people making those commitments has gone down. This year, especially toward the end of the year, I was talking about the importance of finishing strong. So the results of that came out that December of 2019, we saw the highest or the greatest giving in that month compared to other Decembers, the highest one we've had since 2013. It's the second year in a row that we've had budget surpluses. We used to always have a budget surplus back in the 80s and 90s. That disappeared. Some people mark dramatic giving changes in the church, not just ours, but the church in the U.S. after 9/11. And so you can see that in the numbers. Whether that was the only reason why, it's hard to determine, I think. But at any rate, so our December giving was up for the last 2 years in a row. Our overall annual giving was above what we had budgeted and what we spent. So all those are kind of signs of increased financial strength and commitment from the people who are already here. So we were able to close the books with positive balance. Our endowment funds, which fund parts of our ministry, they're continuing to grow as well. So all of those are positive signs for the financial strength and stability of Boston Avenue.
I think there's an important balance when talking about church finances to strike, which is the balance of we want to be transparent and share financial information. We also don't want folks to interpret good news as a reason to stop giving.
Correct.
And I think from a millennial perspective, there's often a lot of criticism of churches with large budgets. They're using all of this money are they even helping people with it? So with a concern like that, how would you help somebody understand what we do with money in the church?
Right. I think it's easy to criticize an organization or a group of organizations like the church, but I think it actually often misses the nuance in terms of not all churches are alike, not all church budgets look alike, and not everybody understands how a church budget works. So if you assume that the church budget is all geared toward only those who are already in the building, that is, those who are already members or those who already participate, I can understand the criticism of they're not really helping anybody. But even in that case, what I experience is that humans need ongoing spiritual nurture. We believe as Christians that we need to gather for worship, that we need to gather to pray, that we need to gather together to hear each other's heartaches and wounds and breakthroughs and celebrations. And so we live life together as Christians in a community of faith. So even if a church is only doing that, in some ways that's a very valid ministry to help people through the ups and downs of life. But at a church like Boston Avenue, where a significant part of what we do is always looking to reach out to people who don't have a community of faith, who are not experiencing the love of God, who don't have a group of people that they feel like they can rely on, or they don't have a place to come together with others for support in their worship of God and in their everyday decision making or living. When you have that kind of emphasis of those who are not here yet, then I think those kind of criticisms about, oh, look, they have a huge building and they have a huge endowment and that's all they care about, really miss the point of sort of our main purpose in terms of reaching out to people to share the love of God in the name of Christ.
I want to go to your second point, which is inclusion. Like you said earlier, inclusion this particular point isn't just at Boston Avenue that we're discussing. It's United Methodist wide. All across the world, in all United Methodist churches, they're discussing this. What is Boston Avenue's stance going forward, and what are we going to do around inclusion?
Right. So for those who don't know, the United Methodist Church has sort of a guidebook or a rule book or a policy book that we call the Book of Discipline. The Book of Discipline can be changed every 4 years when there's a global gathering of representatives or delegates from across the globe representing United Methodists from their particular locality or region. So in 1972, when that group met, they began to add some language in that Book of Discipline suggesting that homosexuality was incompatible with Christian teaching. That was the phrase they used. So it began what I would call discrimination or exclusion of a certain group of people. Over the years, that's been discussed and debated every 4 years whenever these delegates would meet. Most recently, it's become more heated and more restrictive language has been added until the most recent meeting, which was especially called to deal just with that language in our Book of Discipline. And with the global vote, there were about 20% of the U.S. delegates, and the rest of the globe, about 30%, 33%. They ended up with a 53% majority compared to the 70 or 80% of the U.S. delegates voting in a different way. So that 53% voted for more restrictions and more exclusion, even though a majority of the delegates from the U.S. were voting for more inclusion. But there's been this huge backlash across the United States since that meeting, which happened in February of 2019, so that now coming up on our next regular meeting, which is in May of 2020, the proposals that are coming are suggesting that the best way forward is to sort of subdivide, where there'll be the group that would like to be more restrictive would organize themselves under a different denominational name, and the rest of us would go ahead as the United Methodist Church without those restrictions. So what I would call that is full inclusion for the United Methodist Church. That's certainly the position I have taken here as the pastor of Boston Avenue, and our leadership has discerned, however you'd like to say that that's the best path for us, and that's truest to our own history and our own tradition in terms of seeking to share the love of God with whomever comes here without additional restrictions based on, in this case, sexual identity or sexual orientation or gender identity or gender expression. So anyway, so that's kind of the background to all of that. So I would say our position is what I would call full inclusion for the LGBTQ community.
Would you be able to tell us about the event that's coming up to celebrate inclusion?
Sure. On Saturday, we have a service which is one of a series of services we've been having that's part of what we call the Resist Harm movement, which is a national grassroots movement that's arisen since the more restrictive items were voted on that exclude LGBTQ people from leadership in the church, particularly in terms of being a candidate for ministry or a person that is openly identify themselves as in the LGBTQ community. They've been the rules right now say that they can't be a clergy person in our denomination, those kind of things. So anyway, there's been this Resist Harm movement, and we're part of that in Oklahoma, and so we're having services at least once a month of support and connection, affirmation for people that agree on all this in terms of that we should be more inclusive and that we want to do all we can to stop harming people that are part of our faith family. So on Saturday, we're having a service So we'll be into February, so the theme for February is love. And this particular service will be called a service affirming commitment and connection. So we'll be doing this with other churches that are in the Resist Harm movement from around the Tulsa metro area. It's an intergenerational or family event, so we'll have a children's sermon as part of that. We'll have a person from our congregation sharing their own personal witness of what it's like to be in the LGBTQ community. It's a person who grew up in a parsonage. Her father was a United Methodist pastor. So she has quite a history with Methodism personally, so she'll be sharing part of her story with us. Then we'll also have some interactive pieces of the service as a way people can respond to where they are in their own journey at this point. So obviously we'll have some liturgy and praying and singing, but it'll be a service here at Boston Avenue in the sanctuary at 1 o'clock on Saturday, February 1st.
And if anyone is interested in any more resources surrounding inclusion, they can go to YouTube, to our social media pages. We had a holy conversation surrounding inclusion recently. At the end of May, going into June, we had 3 LGBTQ plus People of Faith podcasts that we recorded, and we have a number of those type of podcasts coming up starting next week. So you can stay here and listen for any more resources surrounding inclusion.
Well, and also there is a resistharm.com. So if people want to see more about what's going on nationally, the resistharm.com website has not only testimonies about people in the church and harm that's done, but also the work that is being done now. It has educational and worship resources. It has some marriage equality resources. So all kinds of things going on across the country. And the resistharm.com is a great place to look for more resources for what's going on within Methodism these days.
I think this flows really well into kind of that third point that you made in State of the Church around digital ministry. We're talking about all of these resources that can help folks grow in inclusion or explore that idea or that theology. And they've all been digital resources, whether it's websites or podcasts or social media channels. So for that digital ministry piece that you were talking about, I think that can be a really hard move for people who are so used to a more institutional building-based church to think about church in digital spaces. So how are we making that not necessarily a pivot, but how are we expanding into that area? What are we thinking about? Where are we going with this? And what does it mean in the context of our church life and programming? Will we cease to exist as a building?
I doubt that Boston Avenue will, given our buildings on the National Register of Historic Places and that kind of thing. And people come from across the country and around the globe just to see the building. But we also have guests every Sunday who come here to worship with us, partly because of the beauty and the majesty of the building. Only this last Sunday, we had people identify themselves from several different states who were with us for worship, who were traveling either on vacations or here for business. They had heard about Boston Avenue and wanted to come and worship with us. So I think the interactive nature of worship and people's desire to be together in their worship of God will continue to be a foundation on which Boston Avenue flourishes in terms of its building and ministries and programs in the building. Yet there are, especially in our younger generations, a good number of people who say they're not interested in being a large space with 1,000 people or 500 people for a worship experience, and they would like to still access spiritual resources, but they would be more comfortable doing it in a small group, whether that's online or in person. A lot of people who want to explore spiritual life and have spiritual questions that would be more comfortable in an online chat or an online Bible study, or being able to access some resources on a website or a podcast like we've just been talking about. So I think it's a both and strategy that will continue to do things which are traditionally associated with church, like a Sunday school class, a Bible study, small groups of people gathering for education, fellowship, prayer, those kind of things, as well as corporate or group worship. Although worship is taking different forms these days in the U.S. from what we would call traditional liturgical worship, which has been the mainstream of worship at Boston Avenue for years and years, but now we also have our 13th Street worship experience, which is more informal, more interactive, band-driven in terms of music compared to organ as the instruments that are used in those experiences. So I think the variety, I think what we know is we live in a pluralistic society and people have different needs and different personalities. So if we want to reach a broad range of people, we too have to offer different channels and different platforms for that. So I think the move to digital is just one more piece of our strategy to represent or embody the love of God and the love of neighbor in the work we do together.
What has some of the feedback been on your presentation or on particular elements or points within the state of the church at Boston Avenue?
So far, the responses I'm getting both written as well as in person have been very positive. I think people are eager to understand and to have more information about what's going on in the church. As I referenced earlier, there is a lot of uncertainty, which creates an anxiety, I guess is the best way to put it. So having more information is good, I think, and helps people feel a little more reassured that they understand what they're a part of here at the church. They understand kind of the direction we're trying to move together as a family of faith. They understand when I say, like John Wesley, that we want to be perfected in love, or that we're being perfected in love, meaning that our motivation is fueled by love of God and love of neighbor. But they understand more specifically sort of what that looks like. Oh, that's digital outreach. That's inclusion of the LGBTQ community in our leadership and in our life together. That means, we're going to be really good stewards of the resources we get to make sure we maximize our ministry of extending God's love to other people in the name of Christ. So I think all those kind of finite details that I'm able to share in a longer address in person really encourage people, motivate them, help them experience the joy of knowing that the work we're doing together really makes a positive difference in people's lives, whether it's people who have been harmed and need healing, or whether they've never even known anything about Christianity and are finding it for the first time, or they're new to our city, or they've been disenfranchised from their church and are looking for a new church home. I mean, people come to us in all kinds of states for all kinds of different reasons. And so the state of the church at least gives our people who are already here or are new here an understanding of kind of how we function together as a faith family. I would just mention, we wrote some core values as part of the strategic process review that we started back in 2018, and I unveiled those in a sermon series the first 7 or 8 Sundays of 2019. So if somebody wanted to know more about our core values and how we approach faith, and they wanted to give 6 or 7 different 20-minute, 25-minute time slots to learning about that, they could find those, or they could go on our website and see those core values, because I think that's a great summary of sort of how we're approaching faith, whether it's on a digital platform or in person or some combination of those different ways to reach people.
Do you have anything else you'd like to add?
I think a lot of people see the church in conflict and think it's the demise of the church, or somehow it's so negative that they don't want to be a part of it. What I hope and work for here at Boston Avenue, and when we work in concert with other churches, is in a way to present something different than that fear of conflict and that feeling that maybe this is all going away somehow. I think we are in a very strong position as a church and in our community. We're very involved in interfaith work. We're involved with other ministries, other nonprofits in the city that are reaching out to fight racism, to fight bigotry and bias, to fight prejudice. And so I think that gives us a strength and a vitality that if you've never been a part of a church that works in those kind of arenas, you maybe don't understand at first what we're all about. But when people come here, what I constantly hear from our newest visitors, our newest guests, is that they were more warmly welcomed and more readily embraced, and people were eager to get to know them than they expected. And so that's what we want. We want to extend that kind of over-the-top hospitality because we believe that that is how God approaches us. I believe that's what Jesus embodied in terms of how he interacted with people. We want to be like that. And the responses we get from people, whether they're just passing through town to visit 1 week or they're actually seeking a community of faith, is that when they come to Boston Avenue, they are surprised by the warmth of the welcome and the acceptance and the ability, even in a church with lots of people, to get to know people as individuals, to get to know people personally and what they need and what they're looking for. And so I think that's a very encouraging sign. It encourages me. I believe it encourages people when they come to visit or come as a guest. So for people who are listening to the podcast who have never been here, I would just say, if you have time, come on by and experience it firsthand for yourself.
Thank you so much, David. This has been the Ascends at Boston Avenue podcast. We are located at 1301 South Boston Avenue in downtown Tulsa, Oklahoma. Please check out our social media for more information on what's going on at Boston Avenue United Methodist Church. We can be found on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and YouTube. We'll talk to you next time. Thank you.